Okay, so sometimes during iterations, some clusters can become empty. Why can a cluster be empty? So you should actually think about this. How can, during the run of the k-means cluster, can a cluster be empty? And without thinking any detail, actually, you should say yes, it can be empty, because at each iteration, if you remember, we assign each point to its nearest cluster. So each point is assigned based, so we have cluster centers after each iteration, and each point is reassigned to a new cluster at the beginning of this iteration. So during this assignment process, there may be some cluster centers for which there are no near points. I mean, so a cluster may be left empty at the end of this step. I mean, during this assignment process, when you you assign all the points to their nearest clusters, some cluster centers may not have any points assigned to them. So how can this be possible when we are averaging everything? These cluster centers are not determined arbitrarily. They are the average of their members. So how can a cluster center that is determined as the average of their members become empty at the next iteration? Coming up with an example layout of points is difficult. To demonstrate this, I mean, for example, imagine I ask you this in the exam. It would be a difficult question because it's not easy to come up with such a synthetic example, saying that by using 5 points or 10 points, for example, by using a smaller number of points and using 3 clusters, for example, give me an example layout of these 10 points for k is equal to 3, in which at the end these points are going to be clustered into 2 clusters, but not 3 clusters. How can one of these clusters be empty? What kind of a layout can can get to such a result? Needs some thinking. Last year we discussed this in class in last year's lecture, and I have actually come up with an example. And this example shows, let me zoom in on this. And let's make full screen. Okay, so this is k-means empty cluster example. In this example, we have how many? 7 points, and we want to group them into 3 clusters. Okay, so if you want to group them into 3 clusters, right now the shapes have no meaning. I mean, we have 7 points cluster like that. These shapes show that they're actually 2 natural clusters, maybe 3. Actually, this 3 can be considered as a separate cluster than this cluster, or you can even think of their 4 natural clusters, 1 being this, 3, this is the second cluster, 3rd cluster, and 4th cluster. I mean, the definition of a good cluster is even not deterministic. I mean, everybody, if I ask you, show me the natural clusters in this data set. If I ask you this question, everybody may come up with different answers. There's no unique answer to what is the best cluster here. So some of you may decide to cluster these points into a single cluster, as in this example, but some of you may separate this 3 into a different cluster on its own. So this definition of clusters, how large are, because the size of the cluster, there is no unique concept as to what is the best size of a cluster. You can have clusters, if you do not want clusters of size 1, you may want to put that 0.3 into the cluster just above it. But if clusters of size 1 are okay for you, and this is really I mean, subjective, okay? So there is no unique definition of a good cluster. But let's look at this example, how empty clusters can be generated as a result of k-means algorithm. So k is chosen to be 3. Now, let's choose, we are going to, so there are different versions of k-means algorithm, in terms of how the initial clusters are selected. Some algorithms, some k-means algorithms, they try to select faraway points as initial cluster centers. Some of them, as our algorithm in class, the slides show that we just select random points from the data set as cluster center. That's one way. Okay, so one way is selecting random points, another is using some intelligent strategy to use faraway points as clusters. You can look at the distance matrix and try to select faraway points from that distance matrix. That's another strategy. And there is another one. The initial cluster centers may not even belong to our point set. They may just be imaginary cluster centers randomly chosen. Okay, I mean, because these cluster centers at the end of the first iteration, they are the average of those points. So a cluster center is something abstract. It's not part of the data points. It's the average of data points. But let's assume initially we we use the approach described on our slides, and we choose points 3, 5, and 6. So 3, 5, and 6 are chosen randomly as the cluster centers of these 3 clusters. Okay? And you can immediately see what is going wrong here is that 5 and 6 are not very good choices as initial clusters, because 5 and 6 they need to be part of the same group. There are 2 points at the end what you want to see in the same cluster, but since your initialization is random, you can perfectly see this situation. Okay, since you're randomly assigning points to clusters, 5 and 6, you don't know anything about them before seeing this picture. And at most of the cases, the data you are clustering is not 2-dimensional. Imagine you're trying to cluster a 10-dimensional data set. Okay, our points are 10-dimensional vectors. So you will have no luxury of being able to visualize your points like this. Okay, in a 10-dimensional data, I mean, if you were able to visualize all of your points like this, you don't even need an algorithm. You just plot your points on a paper and you cluster by yourself. Manual clustering would be very easy if you were able to visualize your points in 2D like this, or even in 3D. I mean, if there is a way of visualizing your data set, you can also do clustering manually. However, don't forget that these algorithms are developed not only for 2-3-dimensional data, they target high-dimensional data in which our points lie in higher dimensional spaces like 10, 50, 100, 200 dimensional spaces. So it's not even possible to visualize the points in that original space. So there are also techniques for dimensionality reduction. For example, if we have a 200-dimensional data set, we can maybe reduce it to 2 dimensions or 3 dimensions, which is going to help us visualize the data. So these are the main purpose. And self-organizing map we are going to see after k-means is an algorithm for that purpose. Its main purpose is to have a means of visualizing high-dimensional data sets. Now let's get back to our problem. So since we randomly, so you do not know whether 5 and 6 are close, or I mean, you do not see this picture before the algorithm starts, and the first step of the algorithm is to assign these points, 3 of them randomly as cluster centers. So 3, 5, and 6 are initial cluster centers. At the end of the first iteration, our initial cluster center, this was 3, 5, 6 are initial cluster centers. So 3, 1 to 7 will be in one cluster. So this, at the end of the first iteration, 1 to 7 is going to be closer to this cluster center, okay, cluster center 3. So they're going to be a cluster like this. 4 here, I have placed it strategically so that it's closer to 5, Okay, for here it seems it says equal distance to 3 and 5, but actually it's closer to 5. So 4.4 is going to be assigned to cluster 5, the cluster center at 5 here at the end of first iteration, and 0.6 is going to be assigned to itself as the cluster center. So at the end of the first iteration, the picture looks like this. Let me. Now, before we, so these four are in the same cluster. These 2 points are in the same cluster, and this 0.6 is in a single cluster. So our 3 clusters, none of them are empty at the end of first iteration. There is no empty cluster yet generated at the end of first cluster, and the picture looks like this. So what do? We update cluster centers at the beginning of second iteration. So what we do is, before we begin the third iteration, we need to update we need to find ourselves a new cluster center. So by taking the average of these 4 points, the cluster center is updated to this point. And we have these 2 points in this cluster of 2 points, and it's updated, it's moved to here. And this 6 that was on a single point, the average it stays there. Okay, this is how the picture looks like at the end of the first iteration. Now, what do you see here? That blue cluster at the second iteration is going to have no members assigned to it. Why is that? Look at this blue center. Since its original members are far away from each other, the cluster center appeared in the middle, and it became far away to everybody. This 4 now looks at and say, oh, okay, I'm actually closer to this cluster. The 4 is going to say, I'm going to belong to this cluster, 0.4, and 0.5 is going to say, oh, actually, I'm closer to this cluster 6. So 4 and 5 are going to be assigned to these new clusters, and nobody is going to be assigned to this blue cluster. So at the end of this iteration, we are going to have ourselves a cluster center with no members. So when you're writing your algorithm, if you're going to implement this, for example, you may have at the cluster center update process, what you may have is average all the members. If you don't take care of these empty cluster situation, your algorithm may you may get a runtime error like division by 0, because there are 0 elements here. If your average algorithm, average finding algorithm has this statement which says that sum up all the coordinates and divide it by the number of elements in that cluster, the number of elements in that cluster is going to be 0. So you are going to have a numerically unstable situation. So this blue cluster has no members in it. So you need to take care of these. So we started with 3 clusters, k is equal to 3, but we may end up with less number of clusters than we expected, than we wanted. All right, so let's continue. Any questions about this? How k-means sometimes produce empty clusters? Yes? Yeah, this is what I told. So the question is, are we always selecting the initial cluster centers as one of the data points? The answer is no. I mean, there are different variations of k-means. And in one of those variations, you can just start with arbitrary, abstract, non-existing cluster centers randomly. But in order to be able to do that effectively, you should know the space that your points lie. I mean, if you select randomly at non-existing locations in which are very far away, where your points, all of your points lie, it's not going to be very meaningful. What you can do is, an interesting case maybe, find the bounding box of all the points and assign the corners of these bounding box as your initial cluster centers. So you are going to make sure that your cluster centers are far away from each other in the first iteration. All right. Now, Let's get rid of this. So we have also seen other clustering techniques other than k-means. The UPGMA algorithm we have seen is actually a hierarchical clustering technique. In other words, when we are constructing phylogenetic trees, actually we were constructing our a cluster of our sequences. So there are different types of hierarchical clusters. When determining the distance between two clusters, so imagine we have a cluster here and we have another cluster here. The hierarchical clusters, what they do is, the agglomerative clustering techniques, for example, starting from single points in the data set, they merge these clusters into larger clusters each time. That's why it's called hierarchical clusters. I mean, at a certain level, we have smaller clusters. At a higher level of this hierarchical clustering, we have larger clusters. And at the end, we have a single cluster which encapsulates all the points. At an intermediate step of the algorithm, a hierarchical clustering algorithm, what it needs to be able to do is, it needs to compute a distance between two clusters. What we have seen in UPGMA is what UPGMA does in this case. Do you remember? What was UPGMA? How does UPGMA compute the distance between two clusters? No, not the whole UPGMA algorithm. Just I'm asking, what is the distance between these two clusters? Yeah, the average of all pairwise distances. So it's the distance of you look at all the pairwise distances and you average them all. Okay, this is how you define a distance between two clusters. What about another strategy? Can you tell me? Actually, I guess we have talked about this. Other ways of defining cluster distances. Yeah, I remember we talked about this.
You can find the middle of the clusters, each of them, and you can calculate the distances between them.
Yeah, that's also very good. So since an idea taken from k-means algorithm, maybe for example, you may have a cluster center here, another cluster center. So let me use different points here. And another cluster center here. The distance between these two cluster centers may be your distance between these two clusters. Okay, very good. That's another strategy. Other strategies that you can think of? What is the distance between these two clusters? There are two other techniques, strategies that are widely used. And their names are actually here. So single linkage and complete linkage. Those strategies. What can they be? Just guess. What UPGMA is average linkage clustering. That was taking the average of all pairwise distances. That's called average linkage. Finding the distance between two clusters by using the average. What other strategies can we use? Very good. Very good. So finding the distance between the farthest points. So for example, the distance between this and this maybe, for example. In the two clusters, the distance between two clusters, for example, the clusters may be like this. This picture, this example may not be very good to demonstrate these other strategies. Imagine you have two clusters like this. Okay, we have these plus, and these points. Okay, we have these two clusters like this. Now, what is the distance between these two clusters? What Gökhan said is it may be the distance between these two clusters may be the distance between these 2 points. And this immediately leads you to the final strategy. It may also be the distance between the nearest ones, right? So, when you define this distance between clusters, you may choose to treat these. One question is, if I give you these two clusters, if I ask you the question, are these clusters near each other? probably you will be looking at their nearest members to answer that question. Okay? Yes, they are near. There are these two members. There are two members which are close to each other, so these clusters are near. If your distance measure between two clusters is based on their nearest members, then what you have is a single linkage cluster. A single member is able to link these clusters. However, you may also ask the question in another way like this: will it be good to merge these clusters into a final cluster? Okay. Now, if I ask the question in a different way, however, the results of all these questions is at the end going to lead you to a single distance measure. What is the distance between these two clusters? This is what our algorithm is going to use. But when we ask the question in different ways, for example, do you think these clusters are near each other? You look at the nearest members. And if I ask the question this way, will it be good to merge these clusters? What you will be probably looking at the faraway members, because when merging the clusters, your final cluster size is going to be very large if they have faraway members. Okay, these faraway members is going to give you very large clusters, and you may not want that. So these are the different strategies we can use, either using the faraway points as defining the distance between two clusters, or the nearest points, or the average distances between all the points. So this gives you different ways of clustering. So in complete linkage cluster, the distance between two clusters is defined as the distance between their farthest points. In other words, when we merge in each step, when we merge two clusters, we try to merge the ones which has the smallest diameter. I mean, at the end of the merging, we want the final cluster to have a small diameter. How do you ensure that? You select this distance which is small. I mean, you look at the farthest away points, and select two clusters which has the smallest distance. Okay, we don't want this number to be large. Our main concern is this becomes this number. In single linkage clustering, we merge in each step the two clusters whose two closest members have the smallest distance. So it's like they stick to each other. If we have clusters like this, no matter how far some members are, these two clusters are able to stick these two clusters together, so that's the thing in single linkage cluster. Single members are able to link the clusters with each other. So in order to understand, recall these names. Okay, they are not very intuitive. I mean, they could have said minimum distance, maximum distance, which is much more, I mean, most of the time I forget what was single linkage, complete linkage. It's not very intuitive, these names, but there's a way to remember. So single linkage, single members can link these clusters. In complete linkage, you consider the all members closeness to each other. I mean, if to combine them. Even the faraway ones matter to link it. Okay, and so here, this picture shows the difference between single linkage and complete linkage clustering, similar to the figure I draw here. And an average linkage, the UPGM and neighbor joining algorithms, these algorithms consider all cluster members when updating the distance matrix. So this is, we look at all pairwise distances between all members and take the average, and hence the name average linkage. And there are tools which can run hierarchical clusters on, for example, microarray data sets. This picture shows a microarray data set in which the rows we have genes. So we have many genes, like maybe hundreds of them, hundreds of genes, and like 10 experiments. So this is a matrix. As you can see, this colored matrix. There are some experiments. How many of them? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So I think, yeah, there are 7 experiments, 7 microarray experiments that we have performed. and these are the gene names. Each row corresponds to a gene. And what we may wonder is that we may want to group these genes into several groups based on their behavior in these 7 experiments. As you can see, there are 2 eminent groups, I mean genes that are upregulated and downregulated. There are two main groups here. So if I ask you to group these genes into 2 groups, you would probably say that the genes above this line, the genes above here, are going to be in one group. The genes below this group are going to be in one group. So if I ask you to group this into 2 groups. What about if I say, are all the downregulated genes behave similarly in all experimental conditions? Now, then you will look into more details and see that, for example, some genes are very downregulated, and some of them are not upregulated or downregulated, or we don't have any reading for them at the final 3 experiments, maybe. So you will be able to separate even the downregulated experiments into smaller groups. So this is you can see the benefit of hierarchical clustering. It gives you different levels of cluster based on your goals, how much detail you want to analyze the similarity of these genes. And the cluster result is provided to you here as a tree. If you look at this tree, if you cut this tree at a given level, if you cut this tree here, you are going to get 2 main, for example, if you cut here, you have 1 and 2 branches. However, if you cut the tree here, you get 3 clusters, you get 3 branches. If you cut, for example, if you cut it here, we see that there's a small cluster here. There are a small group now at the boundary of this red and green regions. At the boundary, there are certain genes which are both upregulated and downregulated in these different experimental conditions, just at the boundary. We may not see if we do not zoom in, but that may be your 3rd cluster. If you cut at a different level, you are going to get many, many clusters. So this is how hierarchical clustering provides you this. There's a tool, a free tool called MEV. I think it was Tiger MEV. Multi-experiment viewer. It's free. You can download it. If you just search in Google MEV microarray with these 2 keywords, because MEV is very short to be directly lead you to this tool. So you can, if you do a search like this, microarray, you'll probably get to the correct site. If you download it, it provides you several ways of many clustering algorithms implemented in this tool, like k-means, hierarchical clusters, even self-organizing maps are implemented, and you can load multiple experiments for a certain species in this tool and analyze. Either you can cluster the genes, you can also cluster the experiments, or experimental conditions can also be clustered to separate. As you can see, this tree up above here actually is a clustering of the experiments into groups. So experiments can also be grouped because the experiments may be, for example, conditions like control samples, treated samples. The 2 groups may be control groups, and treated groups may distinguish themselves if you group the experiments into 2 groups, for example. And here is another case in which we have several experiments. Here the experiments are grouped again. Now, that's all I'm going to talk about hierarchical clustering. Now we are going to talk about another clustering technique, which is named self-organizing maps. Before we continue, do you have any questions? Yes?
Can you again repeat the single linkage?
Yes. Yes, single linkage, in single linkage technique, the distance between 2 clusters is defined as the nearest distance between their members. So in order to determine the distance between these 2 clusters, again we look at all pairwise distances. Okay, we need to, in order to find this minimum one, we need to look at all members, pairwise members, And when we look at all these pairwise members, we sort these pairwise distances and we pick the minimum distance as the distance between these two clusters. Yes?
And this process is calculated every time.
Exactly.
There is two clusters.
Exactly. Until there is one cluster left in your hierarchical cluster, we continue this. And we do this for all the clusters. I mean, for all the, let me, it's like this. You may have, at an intermediate step, you are going to have many clusters. And you do this between each pair of clusters. You have, at an intermediate iteration, you have a distance matrix. And you have this distance matrix each time, which shows the distance between all pairs of all current objects you have. And I use the word object deliberately because that object can be a single point or a cluster. So at each iteration, intermediate iteration, you have a mixed combination of clusters, single points. So you need to know, you need to have a distance matrix that shows the distance between all of them. Yes, exactly. We do not change the points locations. When we combine them, we do not need their coordinates. We just, in an abstract manner, we group them as a single point. We do not compute its average and put it in the data set. We do not do it. At each point, at each intermediate iteration, all the original points are maintained. I mean, all the original points, you do not throw them away. Even at the end of the last iteration, you will have two clusters, for example. You need to know all the original points in there in order to compute the distance between clusters. What may be confusing to you is the k-means algorithm. The only thing that matters is the center of the cluster. So we only need a single point for a cluster, but not here. Okay?
I mean, it's confusing because of that. How can we decide all clusters by choosing one of points?
So this is what we do. If you remember the UPGMA algorithm, at each step when we have these several clusters, what do we decide at the end of an iteration? What we decide here is that, so this is the picture. I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 clusters. At the next step, the algorithm is going to decide to merge two clusters into one larger cluster. Okay? So this should clarify. I mean, if you know what's going on, it should be clear. I mean, by looking at all the pairwise distances, we are going to decide to merge this and this maybe. Okay? If we decide to merge this and this, that merger is done. We do not, back up this merging. When we decide to merge these, they are merged. Now it becomes a single new cluster, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 clusters I have. I compute the distance again between all pairs of clusters and decide to merge another pair of it. Okay. Any other questions? So now let's continue with a more complicated algorithm than k-means, which is self-organizing maps. And if you read the literature about self-organizing maps, different books, different websites, I mean, they all describe self-organizing maps differently, meaning that, I mean, some of them, they use different terminology. Some descriptions may describe this as a neural network, artificial neural network type of algorithm, and therefore use terminologies commonly used in artificial neural networks. Some of them use different terminologies. So you may see, I mean, you may get confused if you look at different sources. I mean, you may even think, am I looking at the same algorithm that we have seen in class? I mean, it may be this confusing, but do not be confused. If you understand the steps very well, I mean, if you really understand the steps I'm going to talk about today, you should have no difficulty about understanding those descriptions or any other description that you're going to see in another source. here there are certain components that are key components I'm going to talk about, and you should, if you understand these key components, you can have these correspondences between terminologies. First of all, self-organizing maps, its main purpose, it was developed as a visualization tool first. Okay, its goal was to visualize higher dimensional points on a 2D map. And the idea is like this. For example, again, I'm going to give the example of students in METU. Okay, students in METU. If you look at the file, the official file in the student's registry, for example, if you look at the file of a student, you are going to see many things about that student. Okay, when did the student enter this university, what class, gender, where she's from, GPA, department. So we have many features, we have many properties about a student. So what makes if you're going to represent a student on computer digitally, these are the features, I mean, of your student. I mean, for example, you do not care about his or her personal life. That's not one of your features. But what you have is in academic life, okay, these are the things. Maybe what year you were born, where you're from, they may be also personal. But there are certain things that you consider in that file. So when you store this student in this database, that student becomes actually a point in a very high dimensional space. Okay? So let me try to clarify this with an example. Each of these features are going to be one of your dimensions. Your coordinates, when I say high dimensional space, do not directly think of the real 3D space we live in. Because in real 3D space we live in, each of the dimensions are compatible with each other. They have the same units. Okay, when I'm going to describe a point in this 3D space, I have the x, y, z coordinates. The x, y, z coordinates of this x, y, and z, they have the same units. We may have the centimeters or meters. But when I talk about this student example, our dimensions are going to be, for example, what year you were born. The year you are born is going to be one dimension. Okay, a student, for example, if you just look at the year born, for example, 1985, 1990. Okay, so a student, based on what year she is born, is going to be a point on this axis. Okay, we do not have the other axis yet. So if we are just considering the single dimension, each student is going to be a point in this linear, in this dimension. You can place yourself, based on what year you were born, you can place yourself as a point on this axis. For example, add a new feature to this representation, for whether you're an undergrad, graduate student, or for example, master's student or PhD student. Now, we have another axis which has only 3 values: undergrad, MS, PhD. Okay? Now, this is another axis. Now, what it provides you is that now you're not going to be points on this axis anymore. You are going to be points on this plane. For example, an MS student who is born in 1985 is going to be this point. An undergraduate student born in 1990 is going to be this point. A PhD student who is born in 1985 is going to be this point. As you can see, now we can still visualize our students, but I have mentioned many features to your GPA, where you're born, for example, where you are born, the city is going to be how many? 81 dimensional, a single dimension with 81 discrete born cities in Turkey, for example. Maybe if we have also international students, it may be countries. So as you can see, you're going to have different dimensions. And as these dimensions get higher, you will not be able to visualize them on a board like this, on a 2D paper. If I give you all the students' information, all the files that the students registry, and I tell you, for example, I want to see whether certain groups of students coming from a certain city are more represented, how are their GPA, what is their, I want to see this, I want to picture the whole space of students, okay, on our campus, the whole space of students, I want to visualize it. How are you going to do that? With these many features, right now what we have is these separate files for each student, we have that. But if you want to see all the students, okay, 15,000 students, and try to visualize their distribution, these histograms, how are you going to do it? Okay, many dimensions. What you can, one way to do is just select two of the features. Select, for example, class level and year. If you select two of these features, what you get yourself is a projection of these two, all the students on these two dimensions. Because this is going to be a projection on two dimensions. But when you do it, you do not consider, you ignore all the other features that the students have. You ignore the GPA, you ignore where they are born, you ignore all the other features when you visualize them as points like this. Now, self-organizing maps was an idea to be able to visualize all these high-dimensional data points on a 2D map like this, hence the name map. Okay? The map comes from the need that to visualize high-dimensional data points on a 2D picture. And what we want to do is we don't want to ignore any feature. By considering all the 100 features of students, all the features, we want to be able to map students on this 2D map. We want to be able to visualize by considering all dimensions. We don't want to get rid of 98 dimensions and use 2 of them. Use all 100 dimensions and yet put a student on a point on this map. How do you do that? What would you do if I give you this as a homework? Some new ideas. What would you do? Just think practically. You don't need to tell me the exact algorithm. Just some ideas. If for example, how would you draw this picture? Okay, let me give you 100 students. Put 100 students on this paper. You can represent each student as an X like this. I want you to put 100 students on this map considering all these features. Now, if I tell you these considering all the features, the dimensions of this map are not going to be one of your features. It's just arbitrary. The organization of this map, the location, has no meaning. The x-axis and y-axis of this map has no relevancy to your features. Okay? I just want to do what I want to do is I want to visualize these 100 students on this map. How would you place this student? For example, are computer science students going to be close here? Biology students, for example, map all or students that are undergrads. So how are you going to place yourself, for example, place these 100 students on this map? And this is what self-organizing maps try to do. Try to map each of these students onto this map. Any ideas? Yes?
I try to find as many common properties that the student has.
Mm-hmm.
I put him or her there.
Okay, very good. But you should, with an empty map, what would you do in an empty, for example, to be able to do that, you need to have, for example, placed the person before somewhere. And if that person has a common, you pick another student. If that student has some common properties to this existing person, you put it somewhere close, right? This is what you mean, right? You need to have somebody previously put here in order to be able to compare, to find common points. Or what you can do is you can maybe look at all students and find groups of students. For example, you can run k-means algorithm to find clusters of students and try to put those clusters onto this map. I mean, you could use k-means to do that. K-means to create 5 clusters of students, and after you generate the 5 clusters, you can find distances between these 5 clusters and put those clusters accordingly. Your k-means students, it may be 6 clusters, and you put them like this. But are there really 6 groups? How do you know there are 6 groups? What if there are 20 groups of different students? So therefore, that's the main disadvantage of k-means, to give this number k as an input. How do you know there are 6 groups initially? Okay, now it's time to, actually let's have a break. You think about this during the break, and I'm going to describe the self-organizing maps. So what's the solution proposed by self-organizing maps to solve this problem we are going to see in the second hour.